Hello, I'm Jim Richberg, the Public Sector Chief Information Security Officer at Fortinet, and I'm hosting another episode of this podcast series on cybersecurity for ATARC. And with me today, I have another guest from CISA. Branko, would you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us what you do at CISA, and then I think we've got a fair amount to talk about in terms of cybersecurity.
Yes, we do. Hi, Jim. Thank you. And good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Branko Bokan from Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think we are still the youngest federal agency as part of the Department of Homeland Security. And in line with the mission of our parent agency to protect the nation against all kinds of all kinds of threats, the mission of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is to protect the nation against cybersecurity threats. The office I work in right now is focusing exclusively on federal civilian executive branch agencies, protecting those agencies, but the work we do reflects on the rest of the nation and all kinds of industry and all kinds of organizations outside of the federal enterprise.
Yeah, I've noticed that again. I spent 34 years in government. What we do in government is in many cases intended to serve federal customers, but it has longevity beyond that. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is another case of things they set standards for government that become standards for the public sector, private sector, and then even the baseline for global standards as well. So
absolutely. And not only that, people don't realize we are the biggest IT enterprise in the world. We do a little bit of everything. Any organization, you pick any organization out there in the world, there are elements of what they do in federal government, from flying objects in space to printing money and operating nuclear power plants. That we do a little bit of everything. So everything we do obviously reflects on the rest of the IT enterprise in the world.
Yeah. So we're doing this as a podcast. We're doing this virtually, which clearly reflects the fact that we are still not in the midst, but not at the end of the tunnel on this global pandemic that has fundamentally transformed the way we have operated, the way we have done cybersecurity. So Branko, why don't we start by saying, from your perspective at CISA, what are some of the lessons learned from how the federal government, from how your agency dealt with the pandemic? What worked, and frankly, what didn't work as well as you might have thought going into it?
Yeah, that's a very good question, a very good way to start this. When the pandemic started and we went into this extended telework, some agencies were already prepared. They were already managing telework in a proper way, and this was just business as usual for them. Some others struggled initially because this was not something they were ready to do, not in this extended work. So what we did at CISO, again, we realized, and we've heard from agencies, we listen, we work with agencies, we listen to what they have to say, we listen to their concerns. One of the initial concerns that we were hearing was, now the threat landscape is going to change. Things that threat actors are doing against those organizations, regardless of where they are, whether they're in federal government or private industry, they're going to do something new. So we immediately started some analysis, and we realized that not really. The threat actions, those tools and techniques that adversaries are using are the same. Their distribution, their frequency, the way they use them, the topics of subject lines in phishing emails may be different, but the tools themselves remain the same. We immediately established a center of excellence in telework here at CISA to help agencies to learn about these concerns and come up with recommendations for agencies that are actionable for them, that they can use and go and run with them. One of the interesting concerns that we found and issues that most organizations had is, now suddenly you have a lot of workforce that is away from your organizational networks. They're routing all their traffic back into organizational networks through usually VPN and some type of remote access. But the old types of the same cyber hygiene and same type of requirements remain. And now the patching and all these other security tools and security traffic was competing with other traffic and VPN traffic that had to go through those limited bandwidths. So one of the first things that we realized is that managing vulnerabilities, patching those remote devices was no longer as easy as it used to be when all your devices were within your reach. And that was one of the first recommendations we issued for federal governments in line with our TIC recommendations. And we'll have a chance to talk about it later, how this whole concept of remote access and VPN and split tunneling, if you remember in the old days, split tunneling is a big no-no, how now we allow organizations to do and channel their traffic through different channels, their different routes to achieve different things, including remote patching. So that was one of the early lessons learned from this enhanced telework status.
Yeah. I'm with a company that sees a lot of threat activity every day too. And I would agree that it didn't change in character. It changed in where the targeting was. It's like the old Willie Sutton thing, why do you rob banks? So it's where the money is. When the users left the office and went home, the threat actors followed them. And they were now doing what could have been the same techniques, different subject lines. If you go with Maslow's hierarchy, spear phishing is more attractive when it's not the Nigerian bank scam thing, when they're talking about you've been exposed to COVID. Last year, pre-vaccine, when anything that started to implicate your health or your kids' health, people were more likely to click on that. The kind of people who said, oh, this is too good to be true, there's no money there, they were more likely to get duped on that. But we noticed that the small office, home office environment, as a rule, is just much more weakly defended than the enterprise grade networks that the employees had when they were in the office. And even if you were using government furnished equipment, you were still using this home office infrastructure that most of these people did not know how to change passwords. They probably had never upgraded the BIOS on their firewall. You knew what your kids were doing on the internet. So we noticed a rise in infection using the same techniques as always, absolutely. But the rate of infection was going up because they were now coming in through an Achilles heel that frankly had not been present for most of these offices pre-COVID. Does that ring true for CISO's experience?
Oh, absolutely. And also some of the things we learned early on is that the recommendations, or at least the way we communicated our recommendations in the past, we had to change the tone, we had to change the target of those recommendations. When, one thing is when you talk to big or small organizations and IT shops, you use different types of language and different types of things than those that you want to communicate to your regular end users. And end users have always been that weakest link, regardless of their location. But now, to your point, when they're at their homes. And one interesting thing that I just thought of the other day is when you think about the term Cyber Monday. It was coined in 2005. That was only 15, 16 years ago. The whole idea was that on Monday, when people would go back to their offices, they would shop online because that's where the internet was. The internet was back at work. And at the time, we thought how difficult our work was, that we had to protect these networks that were very centralized and everything is behind this one single firewall and everything was in one place. Looking back in hindsight, we obviously now can laugh and say our job was so easy then, because the internet now is everywhere. The internet is in our pockets, on our phones. I regularly carry 2 phones with me and my watch, and everything is connected to the internet these days. So how we protect and where we focus, especially when it comes to end user as that weakest link, has tweaked our approach a little. Again, no threat actions remain the same, but what we communicate, how we train our users, what we tell them to do and not to do has changed. And we've learned a lot from those lessons. And CISA has been putting together this, as I mentioned already, as part of this Center of Excellence in Telework. We've been putting together a lot of resources for organizations of all kinds of sizes, of all flavors, and also the end users. So recommendations that you can go download today, read through, that are easy to read, easy to digest, easy to implement, and benefit organizations and individuals, because we no longer, to the point of internet being no longer at work anymore, but everywhere, and our work is no longer in the office. Our work is everywhere as well. So that thin line between our personal lives and work does not exist anymore. So it is equally important to protect ourselves and our organizations at the same time as we are working or shopping online.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that our expectations for connectivity and bandwidth have changed over time. And I think the pandemic accelerated that further. My experience was some of the early organizations, in terms of sending people back to the workplace, they were continuing to collaborate with video platforms like this. And when they sent people in en masse back to the office, they, in many cases, did not have the bandwidth to support simultaneous video conferencing from people at their workplace, still collaborating with offsite peers, because pre-COVID, you hadn't architected for everybody to have a high-speed connection to do this from the desktop.
Exactly. And we've obviously seen that. And the bandwidth problem was relatively easy to solve. Again, through some increases in bandwidth or some modifications on how we approach remote access and VPN and routing network traffic. But that did introduce some additional both weaknesses and some additional threats that we were not that concerned about in the past. And again, from the proliferation of all kinds of collaboration platforms that were not really regulated. Most organizations did not think to regulate and say, these platforms are authorized, these platforms are not authorized. If you use this platform, these are some of the basic rules, basic hygiene rules you should follow. Fortunately, again, for everyone, CISA was really fast to realize these issues. We were really fast to pull together not just experts within CISA. We work closely with our partners. Again, your organization, your company is one of many partners we work with. We work very closely with partners. We pulled experts from all over the world to come up with recommendations and best practices for organizations and individuals all over the world, not just within our nation.
Yeah, and of course, given your role within the federal government, when they made the pivot, when everybody went home, you very quickly came out with the interim guidance on trusted internet connections to say, look, we've got to recognize people have gone to a different place. That backhauling the traffic back to the agency to get to the data center, when these people now need to directly access the internet, simply doesn't work. And my recollection was, Branko, that came out very quickly from CISA.
Yes, and when you think, so for those of our listeners who are not familiar with trusted internet connection, in the early days, we had offices within organizations that had, again, within government organizations that had their own internet connections. We ended up with thousands of internet connections. So at one point, government realized we need to reduce the number of these connections. We need to introduce certain controls. They did it through what we today call trusted internet connection. But those original requirements from many years ago, I don't even remember, 10, 15 years ago, have come a long way. If you look at TIC 3.0, that is the current version of that trusted internet connection standard, from that very limited organizational network focused where the internet was at the early days. Now we're talking about these use cases. We are allowing we realize that different agencies have different missions. They have different setups, different infrastructures, different needs, and different requirements. We allow agencies within the confounds of these high-level requirements and recommendations within TIC 3.0, we allow agencies to find their individual use cases and adopt and adjust those requirements to their specific cases very quickly. I think, looking back, within weeks of this extended telework mode, the TIC program realized the need for recommendations that are specific to telework. And I already mentioned this remote patching guidance that we came up with. This was all based on the work that the TIC program office developed, where they realized one of the major things, at least one of the things for me that I remember, again, I mentioned split tunneling. That was a big thing in the early days, where we said, if you're routing your traffic back to your organizational network through VPN, you absolutely must cut off everything else, and everything must be routed through that VPN back to your organization. That worked in the early days when we had very little traffic. Today, with video traffic, with voice, with all the patches, and then cloud infrastructure that is no longer within organizational networks, that early TIC 3.0 guidance allowed agencies to do what they call multi-tunneling and create these multiple lines of communication with different targets and different destinations that allowed to alleviate some of the pain that this extended telework introduced.
Yeah. So, I mean, CISA was very nimble in coming out with that kind of guidance. In February, had started with the classic cases of the branch office for, an agency that has a distributed presence across the country. And how do we deal with, the headquarters thing? Remote was a niche case. So I recognize you couldn't do everything at once. You had put that one off. Well, by March, certainly by April, that was now the norm for most agencies. So you very quickly came out with that guidance. So what risks do you think federal agencies and their workforce are going to continue to face in a remote work environment in terms of their connectivity and their security?
So I I try to avoid using the term risk just because it's not that well understood, and we tend to use it interchangeably for many other things. I like to look at different threats or different vulnerabilities or weaknesses that we are seeing now that are specific to this change of mode where we work from and where the majority of our workers are. And again, I think at the very beginning, you mentioned the issues with home equipment. With most federal agencies, we do not allow bring your own devices. We require our end users to use government furnished equipment. However, in order to get to agency networks, you still need to use your home networks. You still need to go through your home internet connection. And there are a lot of weaknesses along that way until your data gets into federal network. And those are some of the things that we see a lot where, again, running devices that are now legacy, that are no longer supported on home networks. Patching is one of top issues that we are dealing with across any organizations, and that also includes your home networks. We really want to educate our end users that even at home, you need to make sure that you're running the latest software on your routers, on all the equipment that is connected to your networks. Passwords. One thing that CISA did, for years we were talking about best practices, and we are publishing best practices for all kinds of things that we do, as well as in cybersecurity. A few months ago, we started with a new concept of bad practices. And in addition to best practices that CISA is publishing, we're also publishing, these are the worst things that we see people are doing. And if you could tweak these things, you could increase your security significantly. And on that far end, on bad practices, using passwords, using common passwords, not changing passwords on your home equipment, and then running patches, running equipment that is no longer supported by vendors. There is no reason to run that old wireless router on your network. They're relatively inexpensive. They're relatively affordable these days. We have to make sure that we run equipment that is properly supported, properly updated, and properly secured even on our home networks.
But part of the challenge, Branko, is when you're dealing with IoT devices, these headless devices that in many cases don't have intrinsic security and can't be patched, then I think that's a challenge for people in the home environment who've become enamored of being able to say, my refrigerator and my washing machine and my doorbell are all able to talk to me. But you really, for most of the population, they have no idea if that is currently secured, and if there is a gap, how they would go about increasing that security. The idea of virtual patching for most home users is a foreign concept. So how do you deal with that? What kind of guidance do you give them?
That's very true. And now we're getting into that area where we, at the beginning I said we realized how when you talk to end users, you use different language and send different messages to your corporate IT. And now we are entering that area when we really get into more technical recommendations, but we have to do that. We have to find a way to do that. So one of the ways that just like it applies to your enterprise networks, when we talk about segmentation and micro-segmentation, that also applies to home networks. Segment and separate those. If you really must have a pressure cooker that connects to the internet, if you really need a slow cooker that is internet ready, and if you see a benefit in it, make sure it resides on a separate network from the network your children are connecting their computers and doing their homework from the networks that you're banking online from or filing your taxes, and obviously from those networks that you are using to do your work. So that is a relatively easy step. Most home devices, most home networks and home router today allow those guest networks, allow segmentation of networks. That is a very easy, relatively easy step for most end users that can achieve tremendous results in a long term.
I think, Branko, we've had the greatest success as somebody who's been in the industry in this field a long time as you have, when we make things secure by default, when we change the default settings. I remember 15 years ago when we were telling people, you need to change the default passwords. Well, the vendors were shipping him the devices with things like admin and password. And then remember when vendors started putting unique passwords on every device. And I think we're now, you were talking about segment your networks, we have the capability, and we're now starting to see some vendors send it out with at least 2 segments on it, one for work, one for home. You can certainly abolish the second one and run it flat, but many people will not change a default setting. So I think it's incumbent on us, on CISA, to make recommendations, on your industry partners to say, we're going to give it to you in a more secure configuration, recognizing many people are never going to change the default settings.
That is true, and again, for those of you listening, most of the devices that you buy today, they have that guest network that probably it comes pre-configured with, and that's a good opportunity to connect those IoT devices that you don't necessarily need for work to those guest networks if they absolutely need internet access. And again, to your point, Jim, going back to what I said earlier, that is why it is extremely important to run and operate devices that are still supported by vendors. And again, it starts with that wireless router of your network, which is the center of your home network. If you go to the website for the vendor and that device is listed as not supported or not even not listed anymore, that is a good sign that you probably need to upgrade.
So it has certainly been a consequential year and a half. So from your perspective, sitting where you do at the hub of government response and activity, what are the most notable cybersecurity events that have happened since we had the start of the pandemic? And what would the takeaway be from some of those events from your perspective for the audience?
Yeah, so moving back from that end user focus, looking back at this federal enterprise, looking back at this bigger federal IT infrastructure. In 2015, Congress gave CISA, the Department of Homeland Security at the time, authority to issue binding operational and emergency directives, which are really binding mandatory directives for federal agencies that we issue in response to cyber events and cyber incidents or major vulnerabilities that are discovered. And in 2000, so the authority was given to us in 2015. We issued several binding operational directives, which are more strategic in nature, but emergency directives were the one that are really issued in response to emergency, as the name suggests, to emergency events. They usually are issued within a few hours or a few days and give federal agencies few hours or few days to patch or do certain things, change configuration settings in response to specific threats. The reason I'm bringing all this up is the authority was given to us in 2015. We haven't issued any emergency directives until 2019. In 2019, we issued our first emergency directive in response to worldwide DNS tampering. And that was one directive in an entire year. In 2020, we issued, I believe it was 8 emergency directives, something like that. It was, no, 8 in total. I believe we issued 4 in 2020. And then in 2021, which is not over yet, we issued 4 emergency directives and 6 what we call supplemental directions or updates to those directives. It just tells you how much our workload has increased over the last few years, from no directives at all, no emergency directives at all, to 1 a year, to now 8 or 9 in less than a year. And we are still working on some of those. Some of the major events that we saw last fiscal year or this calendar year was probably one of the biggest events was the the supply chain compromise that we saw with SolarWinds, right? Where we are now focusing on protecting our networks and protecting devices that reside on our networks, but this supply chain compromise takes place totally outside of our network. Happens on a network of a vendor that we rely on and trust, and we assume the network is properly protected, or the vendor is protected. We download the product that is now compromised. We deploy this product, and this product, SolarWinds, for those of you listening that you're not familiar with the product, SolarWinds is a product that most organizations use. SolarWinds is a company that obviously makes a lot of different products. The particular product that was compromised, SolarWinds Orion, was a platform that many organizations use to manage their network devices across the network. In order to manage those devices, these types of products, these types of platforms must have elevated privilege. They must have administrative access to all these devices across your network. And this is what we refer to as crown jewels of your network. If you really want to get hold of someone's network, try to get hold of that one device that manages the rest of the network, and you own the network. And that is really what happened. But this compromise now happened outside of those organizations. The product itself was compromised in the supply chain years before we even discovered it. And then last year, we had thousands of organizations across the world, across the nation, that were running these compromised devices that were owned by foreign adversary that now controlled or had access, elevated privilege access to those networks.
And of course, those kind of compromises can be particularly not only impactful because of the privileged access, but if you're looking for a change in status, you're not going to find it because you may have installed it and it was compromised from the get-go. So, organizations that are on top of their game are doing change management. They're looking for something to change its behavior. But if it was corrupted from the get-go, or if it happened and it looked legitimate, then that's why when the National Institute of Standards and Technology defined critical software as part of the executive order that the president signed in May. Critical software covers, from my perspective, pretty much anything that is a networking or security product.
That is true, and to that point again, critical software and in response of that executive order is a really good example, and something else that you just mentioned. It is extremely hard to detect. Once you have this type of compromised software in your network, the adversary only needs a very small fraction of time to get inside your network. And once they're inside with these elevated privileges, they're free to roam around, move around your network. They no longer need that initial vector. You can now go and patch or even completely remove this compromised software from your network. The adversary is inside and they're free to roam around. And this is one of the things that we learned, and one of my colleagues talks about it a lot, that adversary, one of the major lessons learned and one of the major shifts in what adversaries are after these days is now they're after identities and identity providers. These are the parts of our network that store all the identity information, that store all the privileges. And once those are compromised, recovery from those types of incidents are extremely difficult, extremely costly, and in some instances require complete rebuild, or not just rebuild, but building a completely new network and then migrating your entire infrastructure to this completely new setup.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about notable events over the last year, I think top of mind probably for many of the people listening to this podcast is ransomware.
Right.
And of course, when ransomware has affected the federal government, when ransomware has affected critical infrastructure, CISA has been at ground zero. You run what the Unified Coordination Group, the way of marshaling your forces to deal with this. So what can you tell us about ransomware as a big strategic issue?
So, and again, it's interesting that all these individual issues and vulnerabilities and threats that we talked about, and recommendations that we have still apply to ransomware. So what I can tell you, and again, ransomware is just another type of malicious software for our listeners, just another type of attack where malicious software gets deployed to our endpoints, to our computers or telephones, and it allows the bad or threat actors to encrypt the content of those devices and require ransom in exchange for releasing that content back to us. So think of all the valuable files you have on your personal computer and your phone, including all your pictures and all the documents. If someone suddenly encrypts them and says you can no longer access those files unless you pay me X amount of money, that data, whether it's personal data or whether it's your organizational data, definitely has some value. And if you have no ways to recover it elsewhere, you may be forced to pay ransom. And
And
our
even then,
message
you may not get it back, right? It's not
exactly, and you may
universal
not
that
even
they give you the key or that it works.
exactly, and even different reputable organizations that are authorities in this area have been changing their recommendations. Maybe you should pay, maybe you shouldn't pay, maybe you should be ready to pay, because we've seen all kinds of scenarios happening. But again, going back to protecting ourselves as individuals or protecting our organizations, the key is updating, making sure that we run updated software. Um, the number one reason organizations cite inability to update their software is running legacy software, running legacy hardware, equipment that is no longer supported by vendors. And this is not only an issue we see at home networks. We see the same issue in big organizations. We have a lot of legacy software that is no longer protected by or no longer updated by vendors. So updates are just, they don't exist, and they're still vulnerable to the same types of vulnerabilities we see in other software. And this is a big issue that we are also targeting at CISA. We already talked about passwords. We've seen a significant reduction of ransomware with organizations that enforce, that's the key word, not just enable multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication. Those of us who work with or for federal government, we know that most federal agencies enforce those PIV cards that we need to use to log into our computers and our devices. Those types of controls significantly reduce your likelihood to be compromised by ransomware.
Yeah. And of course, ransomware points you in the direction of preparation and response. That if something's going to encrypt your data, backups become vital. Backups that aren't connected to the network, offline backups, because many of these threat actors will look for your backups and contaminate them as well. So everybody knows they should back up, but especially getting back to the home user, how many people back up their home network? The reality is most people don't do that. And again, when you can make it secure by default, if you not only have that external drive, it will once a week, once a day even, run a backup on changed files. Sure, you can disable it, but it's when you make the right thing to do, the convenient thing to do, that I think becomes more powerful. But ransomware, I think also, Branko, pointed us in the direction of response. Organizations needed to have response plans. They needed to be able to respond in some cases at machine speed as the encryption started to spread. They needed to be able to stop that, but they also needed to figure out what they were going to do if they had been victimized. And of course, for many, that's called CISA. So what do you all make of that?
That is a great point, and I frequently remind people when we talk about security, we tend as cybersecurity professionals in general, we tend to focus on protection or prevention of bad things from happening as humans. As cybersecurity professionals, we need to remember that protection is equally important as detection and response. So for years, we've been talking about these three critical functions of cybersecurity: protect, detect, and respond. So equally important to putting all these measures in place that prevent bad actors from getting into our networks, that prevent malware from getting on our devices, that prevent all these bad things from happening. At the same time, as cybersecurity professionals, we always have to remember and understand that bad things cannot be prevented 100% of the time, right? And that is the whole concept of risk management. The basic premise of risk management, and then we talk about risk management a lot in cybersecurity, is that you are carefully weighing that risk and deciding what is acceptable and what is not. And the certain level of residual risk will always exist. And that level of residual risk tells you that bad things will happen. Sooner or later, something bad will happen. And it is critical for organizations of any side, including our own home networks and own personal equipment, to be able to detect them. And this is especially important for organizations, right? To be able to timely detect these bad things when they happen, because we've seen in the past that it used to take hundreds of days for big organizations to even realize that they were compromised. The trend has been going down recently, but it still takes a lot of time. And then we have that response, which includes recovery. A big part of response is recovery. Do you have backups? Do those backups work? When was the last time you actually tried them? I used to work for a big organization where we once did an exercise, and everyone was very confident. We were backing up religiously, on a daily basis. We have very critical data. And then we did an exercise when we tried to restore our data, and we realized that we were not backing it up properly. We thought we were doing a good job, but when we tried to, fortunately, this was an exercise. This was a great lesson learned. And again, exercises are extremely important in our job. We have to do those regularly, make sure that what we think we practice really work in practice.
And not all the exercises have to be sophisticated and technical. I tell people time and time again, a tabletop exercise, literally getting the decision makers together will, if you just run through a simple hour-long scenario, you may realize, I don't know who we should call for help. Hey, we're missing a key stakeholder here at the table. It doesn't have to be high tech with computers to give you valuable insights in terms of what you want to change. But
Absolutely,
Branko,
and they're always eye-opening.
yeah,
Every time you do, even a 1 hour tabletop, and bring all the decision makers from different parts of your organization, your CFO office. It doesn't have to be, these tabletop exercises are not just for IT. They're not just for cybersecurity. You have to make sure to involve all parts of your organizations. They are fun. They're eye-opening. In my experience, people always enjoy them. They always leave those meetings with big smiles. They leave concerned, but they realize they learned something, right? And every time we do it, we get better, a little better every time.
And my experience is the first time an organization does one of the universal things they'll find out is they missed somebody who's important. Yes. There's a stakeholder. We don't know who to call as an external resource. And one of the takeaways is we thought we knew how we wanted to handle this, and we got somebody who should be at the table and who is. So you talked about security is not perfect, and it never will be. And that points us, I think, in the direction of zero trust. It's a terrible name. It doesn't mean people are not trustworthy. It just means don't trust anything in the network by default. And we talked a little bit about this executive order. The executive order, if you were going to really make it a bumper sticker, said federal government, move to implement zero trust, accelerate your migration to cloud operations. And CISA is central to both of those. You just put out a maturity model on zero trust. You just put out a technical reference architecture on cloud. So what can you tell us about where CISA is going in leading the federal government on this important concept of zero trust network operations?
So a few things before we talk about what CISA is doing, just for everyone to understand, and you made an excellent point, how this is a bad term. It doesn't mean that we don't trust anyone, but that's the concept, right? Trust no one, trust nothing. Yeah. Remember when I said how in the early days, your internet was in the office? We had these heavily centralized networks that we protected, and we assumed if something is on the network, because it was really hard, you either had to be physically in the office or you had to go through certain layers of VPN and all kinds of authentication. Once you're on your office network, whatever's in there is safe. We don't have to worry about it. That's kind of the old traditional way of thinking of security and protecting things. Now with everyone being everywhere and everything being everywhere, by everything I mean our data and our assets and our computers and endpoints, we need to reassess that situation. So zero trust is this new concept that throws everyone off because And partly, there are vendors out there that claim that they provide zero trust, turnkey zero trust solutions, that they have products that you can go out and buy, and suddenly you have zero trust. And that is the most important message I like to communicate today is zero trust is not something you can buy. Zero trust is not something that you can magically turn on your network or your infrastructure. Zero trust is this concept, this way of thinking that now our data is everywhere, our users are everywhere, and you no longer can just assume that if something is on your network, it is safe. You can no longer assume if someone has access to the entire network, they have access to your data. Critical is on one side, critical for zero trust to implementing those concepts is understanding the data, understanding what your data is, where it is, what is it that you're trying to protect, what's the criticality and significance of that data. And then on the other hand, have your users that are constantly authenticated every time they try to do something, every time they try to access. So understanding your user base, identity management, identity and access management on one side, data, understanding data and their criticality and location on the other side are some of the critical concepts.
Yeah, I think zero trust is so important in moving security from something based on location. Are you inside the network, in which case, home free, do what you want? Are you an outsider? Are you a guest? In which case, we treat you differently. To say, validate the user, validate the device, give them the minimum, the least privileges they need to get the job done. If I need to look up something in a file, why give me the ability to write to that file, or even worse, delete that file? Give me what I need to do, and ideally do this dynamically. Say what you did when you did this application, you needed this set of privileges. Now you're doing something different. It comes with a different set of privileges, and ideally, now you're doing something that doesn't even map to what's normal for that application. But it's not saying people and their devices are not trustworthy, just don't trust by default.
Exactly. And now going back to what CISA is doing, because this is not one thing, because zero trust is not one product that you suddenly buy or deploy on your network or you turn on. Almost everything CISA is doing these days for not just federal agencies, but also for our wider audience is geared toward that concept of zero trust. You already mentioned the maturity model we developed, which is an excellent document, and I highly recommend everyone to at least skim through it, to understand those concepts, understand the stages of where you start when you even want to start thinking about zero trust to where you need to be eventually many years from now. You already mentioned TIC 3.0. The TIC group is doing a tremendous job publishing these different use cases and different scenarios for different implementations that are all geared towards the principles or based on the principles of zero trust. Another project that CISA is in the process of building, and we really expect to release it very soon, is this protected DNS, protected domain name system solution for federal agencies that will now allow agencies to protect not only their agency networks, but also protect those roaming and nomadic devices, protect your mobile devices with DNS firewalls, DNS protected DNS that will serve all the devices that belong to federal agencies and that can be protected in the same way in a centralized manner.
Yeah. This has been a great conversation, Branko. We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of different topics, but is there one final word you'd want to leave the audience with that can be either advice to remote users, advice to people who are planning agency operations, advice to the workforce? I mean, what would your final takeaway be to leave the audience with from CISA's perspective?
So again, understanding that our viewers and listeners come from all kinds of backgrounds, and that we have, hopefully we have IT professionals and cybersecurity professionals, but we have all kinds of federal employees and not necessarily federal employees listening and watching us today. It will be hard to come up with one single recommendation for all of them. But what I can tell you is go to CISA.gov. CISA's website is packed with features and products that are targeting all kinds of and all flavors of organizations of different sizes, different industry, different government levels, and all kinds of users, from expert IT professionals to expert cybersecurity professionals to your regular stay-at-home users. We have resources for everyone. I highly recommend everyone goes to CISA.gov/telework. That is our starting point for everything related to telework. We have recommendations for IT specialists, for cyber professionals, for C-level suite, as well as end users. That's a great starting point. So if there's one takeaway from today, CISA.gov/telework.
Yeah, it's a wonderful resource. It will, as you said, Branko, it will make sense whether you're a cyber expert or whether you're somebody who's simply looking for better ideas on how to secure your home network. So thank you for your time. And I thank the audience for tuning in and giving us this opportunity to tell you where CISA is, to give you a perspective on some of the consequential things that we've gone through in terms of IT and security over the past year and a half. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.